Okay, hello everyone. So the Stephen Lee question here is how much did the Wilhelmine governments achieve in the domestic sphere between 1890 and 1914? You've got all the knowledge here. We've covered it using Leighton and Carr, but what Lee does is very efficiently pulls it together into a sort of whole package which you could adapt to quite a lot of essay questions should it appear in section A. What he basically does is he identifies 6 criteria for evaluating the achievement of government. So we'll work our way through each in turn. The first one is the issue of efficiency, and the best way to view this is if you imagine you've got 3 elements. You've got the Kaiser, and then you've got the Chancellor, and then you've got the Reichstag. The Kaiser is head of state. The Chancellor is the executive and the Reichstag is the legislature, and the key point with efficient government is the Chancellor is key. Okay, he is pivotal, as is mentioned there. If you're going to have an effective administration, basically you've got to have cooperation between the Kaiser and the Chancellor, and you've got to have cooperation between the Chancellor and the Reichstag. And as is pointed out here, before 1890, both of the above had been achieved. And I think that word pivotal is a key one. The Kaiser gave the Chancellor personal power, and the Reichstag was on the whole cooperative with the Chancellor. Bismarck had been able to work very well with the Reichstag. But basically what happened after 1890 is that pivotal role changed. In fact, the Chancellor became, there's a nice quote there from Lee, less and less pivotal. Why? Because the first element, the Kaiser, asserted more personal power, was less willing to give power to the Chancellor, and as a result, from the other direction, the Reichstag was more assertive in its criticism of the Chancellor. So as a result, the Chancellors were often caught between the Kaiser and the Reichstag. Unlike Bismarck before them, they were less adept at maintaining that balance. They became less pivotal. So the final section there points out, takes each Chancellor in turn and points out the sort of like weaknesses, the ways in which they were less pivotal. So just have a look through each of those. I won't read through them. Caprivi, Hohenlohe, Bülow, and then Betten and Hollweg. Okay, so that's the first section about efficiency. Thank you. Now, moving on to the next page. The next strand is is this issue about the effective handling of the Reichstag. All of the Chancellors after 1890 struggled to handle the Reichstag. Why? Because the Reichstag after 1890 was very different from the Reichstag, the way in which the Reichstag during Bismarck's rule. There were because it was dominated by 2 mass parties. You've got the Centre Party and the Social Democrats, who between them dominated the Reichstag, and you've got the statistics there about the numbers of seats that they held. And what that basically did is it meant that, unlike Bismarck, the Chancellors from 1890 were forced to make compromises. So, for example, they became very dependent on the right-wing political parties, but most importantly, they were absolutely dependent on the cooperation of the Catholic Centre Party to get legislation passed, because it was taken as a given that the SPD usually and the Progressives would usually oppose legislation. So that was a balancing position, and the Catholic Centre knew that they had that power, and as a result, Chancellors had to trim legislation. They had to slim it down. They had to make compromises. So there were some examples of that. E.g., in 1909, the Bülow bloc, which was the combination of the right-wing parties that worked together to support Bülow, following the Hottentot election of 1907, that collapsed on the issue of the inheritance tax that Bülow had proposed to help finance the Navy law, which forced Bülow's resignation. And the new government had to basically entice the Centre Party back into another coalition to pass that measure through the Reichstag. There was only one occasion when the government freed itself from the reliance on the Centre Party, which was mentioned just before, was 1907, the Hottentot election. And again, a nice little quote from Lee there for you to use. Moving on, the third strand of measuring efficiency is social reform. Okay, now governments basically society was changing after 1890. Unlike Bismarck, Germany was industrialising under Bismarck, but nowhere near the same extent as after Bismarck. So the industrialisation was a key strand. Now, Caprivi, as you know, his new course introduced various legislation. Make sure you learn these features of legislation, okay, the limits on employment, the mandatory day of rest, Sunday, etc. And on the whole, Caprivi was generally successful. During Bülow's chancellorship, his Minister of the Interior, Posadowski, likewise passed various social legislation to deal with the problems resulting from industrialisation. Okay, which basically was a workforce that it was experiencing difficulties to do with housing and a sick workforce, etc., etc. They needed to be looked after, but in particular the big problem of the growth of socialism. Now, the key point here is the various reforms that were introduced by Caprivi and by Posadowski. It could be argued that they were not really done for the right reason, that they were more a diversionary, conciliatory programme of reforms, defensive, because the government was afraid of the rise of socialism. They felt they needed to divert working class discontent away from revolution by offering reform. So the key buzzwords there. In that sense, those reforms were very similar to the policy of Weltpolitik. Rather than being well intended, they were diversionary, diverting discontent away from socialism, away from revolution, by making the working class more patriotic or by making the working class happier. Now, the next strand, measuring efficiency, is the strengthening the German economy. So, key policies here. Again, returning to Caprivi's new course. His policy, of course, were the commercial treaties that removed the tariff barriers. It lists the countries there, so make sure you learn those countries. The treaties provided an outlet for German industrial exports. Okay, so if you relax your tariff barriers, it works both ways. You're going to get cheap food imports, which makes the workers happy, and those countries that you've made the commercial treaties with will buy German industrial goods, which will therefore keep happy the German industry that makes goods for export. So the consequences. Well, first of all, German farmers, the landowners, especially the Junkers, resented those commercial treaties because they had to compete on very, very harsh terms. It undercut their own sales at home. They had to reduce the price of their own food to compete, which of course led to the establishment of the Agrarian League to press for their interests, that pressure group. So that was the problem there. Bülow's economic policy. So he basically came in 1900, and 2 years later, basically the commercial treaties expired, and he didn't bother renew them. He was working again very much in the interests of the landowners, but by doing that, that of course upset the industrialists. So it swings and roundabouts. So Bülow therefore had to try and compromise. So he reduce the agricultural tariffs in order to keep the industrialists happy, because that would increase exports. But in doing that, the problem that was caused there, of course, is food prices then began to rise, which of course made the working class increasingly vocal. So that Bühler then had to divert money into another round of social reform, which diverted money away from the military budget. So whichever way you turn, you basically got these problems. So the interpretations of economic policy is that at each stage in the process indicates a lack of any consistent underlying policy. That's one view, that policy was reactive, responding to problems as they arose, let's say swings and roundabouts, and that interpretation is consistent with what we know about the Kaiser's personality, which was likewise very volatile and unpredictable. However, another interpretation is that that underlying policy was actually consistent because it underpinned a longer-term strategy, and that longer-term strategy was, of course, to buy off the support of the workers to support an underlying policy of Weltpolitik. So the agricultural tariffs were actually designed to fund the cost of naval expenditure, and the working class was being bought off with social reform. That worked hand in hand with Weltpolitik because it was attempting to stir up the patriotism of the working class in order to divert them away from socialism. So that you could argue there was an underlying consistent policy there. Okay, so again, moving on. Next strand, maintaining defence without upsetting other sectors of the economy. Another priority of the government was to enable Germany to play, of course, that key world role, Weltpolitik. So Germany needed to basically spend money on defence, a lot of money on defence. Now the key argument here is that on the whole, the naval expansion was successful. That was a successful policy. Of course, those key naval laws, make sure you learn the dates, were pushed through the Reichstag relatively easily by the Chancellors. The German population, on the whole, were bought off by the propaganda, the jingoism, that sort of thing, the whole enthusiastic support of naval expansion. There's a nice quote there. On the other hand, you could argue that in terms of foreign policy, it was less successful because it provoked the anger of Britain, which drove Britain into the arms of Germany's continental enemies, which was a key strand that led to the outbreak of war in 1914. To counterbalance that, though, military expansion of the army was less successful. Okay, the Prussian Junkers, in particular, military figures like Schlieffen, were constantly putting pressure on the chancellors to pour money into the military budget. For example, Schlieffen demanded 84,000 men extra. That put pressure on Caprivi in the early 1890s. He really struggled to get that law through the Reichstag, and he was only able to do that by making concessions in return. So the Reichstag was allowed to review military expenditure every 5 years, whereas previously it had been every 7 years. And also, again, in terms of foreign policy, those limitations on the army gave the General Staff, the fact they struggled to get the military budget increase, gave the General Staff a sense of urgency that other countries like France and Russia were catching up with Germany, which was one of the sort of arguments as to why perhaps there was a rush to war in 1914. Strike while the iron is hot. We're not going to be able to build up our army in future because at the same rate. So perhaps we need to go to war sooner rather than later. Okay, and then the final strand of measuring a government is how effectiveness of a government is how effectively will a government respond to unexpected crises. You can't always plan everything. So the Wilhelmine government was not very successful. Lee points out that it was ambivalent. In each case, the government succeeded in making its point, but they actually did very little to resolve the underlying problem that had caused the crisis in the first place. That the trend was to just paper over cracks. And it gives 3 examples of those. Because I'm running out of time, I won't talk you through all of them, but just think that they are the 3 unexpected crises. There was the issue of the colonial administration of Southwest Africa following the 1906 Herero uprising. And a very reactive response to dissolve the Reichstag. But very few underlying changes were made to the way in which the colonies were administered, and that bit back on Germany in 1919 at the Versailles Treaty because the Allies used that as an excuse to take the colonies away from Germany. The fact that the way they had administered them, brutally, not looking after the interests of the natives, the Herero uprising. And then, of course, there's the 1908 Daily Telegraph affair, which was again resolved. The government made its point, but on a deeper level, the underlying problem of the Kaiser's attitude and his unconstitutional behaviour was not resolved. And finally, of course, the Zaben affair of 1913, which was very much of a damage limitation response. But the opportunity was there to bring about fundamental reform, but it wasn't taken. Instead, there was the rush to war, which was possibly seen as the great way out of all of these problems that were mounting, and a reluctance to deal with the underlying causes of those problems. So finally then, a conclusion. During the period of 1890 to 1914, Germany experienced a mixture of there was sound government with periodic reform. Most of that in the early period, give the credit to Caprivi and his new course, but increasingly the tone was political insecurity, which caused domestic policies which were less well considered. It started during Hohenlohe, when the focus began increasingly to switch from domestic to foreign policy. It then continued to Bülow, 1900 and 1909, when the focus was consistently on world policy. And what that did is it relegated domestic issues to the point that policy was reactive, and therefore was inconsistent. It wasn't controlled. It was reacting to problems as they appeared. And to sum up, the reason for that was foreign policy determined domestic policy. Domestic policy took second place overall, so there was a shift over this period. So that's the main argument that Lee presents here. Hopefully that was useful to you. I've got to finish because I'm running out of time. Thank you.